Good morning. We are now up to Parak Dal Mishna Gimel. As we mentioned previously, when it comes to the Torah's obligation to separate Truma from our produce to give to the Kohen, the Torah says, according to the actual law of the Torah, you can give one kernel and you've fulfilled your obligation. But the sages instituted minimum amounts, and are actually a minimum amount, and also suggesting other amounts. Shir Truma, the amount that should be given for Truma. Ayin Yafe. If one is a generous person, he's got a good eye, Achas Me'er Boyim, it's going to be 1 from 40. 1/40th of the grain will be given for Truma. Beis Shammai Yemrim, Beis Shammai say, Mishloishim, 1 from 30, 1/30th is a generous person. Va'beinanis, the mid-level, the average person, Be'chamishim. Going back on the first opinion that the generous person is 1/40th, the average person would be giving 1/50th. He gives 1/50th of his produce. That could also mean that he can be giving the exact same amount to a generous person, but the amount that he gives covers 10 parts more. It's 1 out of 50. According to Beis Shammai, the average person is 1 out of 40. It's 1/40th. V'ra'ah, and the person who's considered stingy, miserly, mishishim, will give 1 from 60, 1/60th, which again can mean that it'll give the same amount as a generous person, the amount, but it's going to be covering more produce. Again, according to Beis Shammai, the miserly person is 1/50th. So what we have here is that the rabbinic obligation to give these amounts, and it's got to be one of these three. You cannot, rabbinically, you can't give less than 60. And actually, according to some opinions, rabbinically, if you give less than 60, you've got to make sure. Well, I shouldn't say that. We will see such a thing that if you give less than 160, you got to make up to 1/60th. Okay, so that's the first part of the Mishnah. Now, just two interesting things I want to mention about this halacha, about these amounts, and that the generous person is 1/40th, average 1/50th, the miserly 1/60th, is that number one, if we're talking about rabbinically obligated truma, such as from vegetables or produce grown in areas outside of Israel that are rabbinically obligated to tithe, to take off trumas and maasros, there a 60th is enough. Okay, 60th is considered appropriate even for generous people. For that kind, the Rabbanan said a 60th is enough. You don't have to go through the 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th is enough. Also, if let's say we're talking about giving the Kohen truma, that's not really beneficial to him. For instance, we said truma tameya. The truma becomes impure, and he cannot eat it. He can use it for fuel. Well, again, that's not really the most appreciated truma, and there also 1/60th would be enough. The Rambam writes that nowadays that the Kohanim cannot eat truma because they have to assume that they are impure and therefore not allowed to eat truma. And therefore, what we do when truma is separated from produce from Eretz Yisrael, it's burned. The Rambam says you don't have to do even a 60th. Then you can already revert back to the Torah amount, the Torah obligation, the Torah amount, which is any little bit of any small amount. Okay, next case of the Mishnah. Taram va'ala b'yadai echad mishishim. You have a person who is typically, call him average, generous. He typically gives, let's just say 1/50th. Halacha is, as we learned previously, that when you separate truma, you're not supposed to separate it in an exact amount, like using some kind of a measuring tool. You're supposed to estimate. As you separate it, you estimate. So in this case, he was estimating, and his intention was to give what he usually gives. That's what he thought he was doing. Taram v'ala b'yadai echad mishishim. He took truma, and it came out being 1/60th. Again, he typically gives more. And, his intention was, when he was estimating, to give what he usually gives, but it lands up being a 60th. Truma. Halacha is that we consider what he did truma, and he doesn't need to do any more truma. Although typically he does more. We don't look at it like a case that we had previously, that he's in the middle of separating. He hasn't completed his separating, and he can complete it afterwards. We say no. We say the halacha is, he meant to separate whatever was coming up. Generally he gives more, and he thought he would be more, and it came up being less. The Chachamim say that's complete. It's done. You don't need to do anything more. So much so that Chazav HaHaisef, let's the guy decided, I got to give more. I got to give the Kohen more. Chai b'maisris. That extra amount that you're giving is obligated to separate Meiser from. Because what the portion that you separate that's actually Truma that goes to the Kohen, that there's no obligation to separate Meisers from. But this extra amount that you're giving, you don't have to give it. You've already separated Truma. It has no more, the rest of the grain doesn't have an obligation of Truma. The rest of it doesn't have an obligation of Truma. By saying that you want it to be Truma doesn't work, as we learned before. If grain is not Tevel, if grain already has been exempted from its Truma obligation, you can't separate it for Truma. So if you decide to do that here, it's going to come out that this amount is liable and to separate Meisers from, the tithes from, because it's not Truma. And it's basically now needs to be dealt with like the rest of the remainder of produce. Okay, so that's that halacha. Next halacha reads the following. Oh, okay, and just one last thing about this, and that is that there's a discussion, difference of opinions about, okay, so we say that this extra amount that you gave, and you called it Truma, but it's not really Truma, so you have to separate Isis from it. This, what you call Truma, can only a Kohen eat it, not a Kohen eat it? So one might say, well, if you're telling me it's Chayiv and Meisris, it's obligated to separate Meiser from them, it's not Truma. If it's not Truma, let anybody eat it. But some say the fact that you called it Truma, and perhaps added to the fact that you typically separate more, then again, you got to give it to a Kohen. Non-Kohen can't eat it. Next case. Ola v'yadai mishishim ve'echad Truma v'yachzer v'yitrei. Kamaishahu, okay, Kamaishahu lamed. That means like this. Literally translated means it came out in his hand from 61. So we're going back to the case before. You went ahead and you were estimating your Truma, and it came out that you took out an amount of 1/60th. The problem is that it was 1/60th from 61 bushels. Okay, you had 61 bushels at 61 sa. Okay, and you really have to take out more than just 1/60th just to cover the minimum. You have to do more. And it came out that what you took out was a 60th, but it was less. It was a 60th. You thought it was a 60th, but it really wasn't. It was less than a 60th. So here it was that you estimated the amount. It came out less than you usually do, but it's also not enough to meet the minimum requirement of what the sages said to give 1/60th. So then in that case, we say that what you separated is Truma, because again, you wanted to separate this as Truma. The Yachsav Yitrim, but now you have to go ahead and separate more, and you have to separate according to what you usually separate. You got to separate more because of the fact that you didn't fill the rabbinic amount of Truma that you have to give. Now, the commentaries say that midaraisa, from a Torah's point, what you separated is done, and everything is and it's fixed. From the biblical point, it's enough. From the biblical point, you don't need the 1/60th. The extra amount now that you have to add is actually a rabbinic obligation. It's a rabbinic obligation. Now the Mishna says they have to do it kamay shehu lamed, as much as you usually do. Meaning, if the case is you should give a 60th, and here you gave a little bit less than a 60th, and you got to add a little bit more. Let's say you typically give a 50th, right? And again, so not only is it not 1/60th, not even a 50th. You typically give 1/50th. So now the amount that you give, you have to now actually the amount you have to make up has to be the amount of what you usually give, which is a 50th through this. So you're gonna have to give more than in the case if you only give a 60th typically. The point is that when it comes out that what came up by you, when you estimated, what came out was even less than a 60th, it was less than the rabbinic minimum, then already you gotta make the sages obligate you to do more. And not just to do more, but to do more than to do up to what you usually do. But here the Mishnah then tells us that what you do for this amount, meaning now to finish up the amount, you actually can do it b'mida or b'mishkal or b'minyan. You can do it by measure, by weight, by number. We learned before that when you separate truma, you're not supposed to separate it with a measure by measure. You're not supposed to do it exact. You're supposed to estimate. What the Mishna is saying here is that halacha only applies to the initial truma. The initial truma, what you initially separate as truma, that you have to do by estimation. But now this amount that you're making up, the makeup amount, which is again a rabbinic obligation, there the halacha is, there the sages said, this you can go ahead and do. This you can go ahead and do just by measure. And again, it's rabbinic, this amount, so therefore they could say you're allowed to do it this way. And they allowed you to do it because the whole point is you're trying to make up to the amount that you usually do. Therefore, they said, well, okay, if you just, basically we're obligating you to make up the amount. For that, you can go ahead to know how to make sure that to make up the amount, you can measure the amount to know that you're making it up and not just, let's say, necessarily doing more than you need to do. All right, so that's that first part of the Mishnah. So once you're going to the extra amount that the rabbi said you have to make up with, there you could actually measure it out. Rabbi Yehuda says, you could even do from that which is not close by. The halacha we learned previously was that if I separate truma from one grain for another, the grain that the truma is being designated for has to be nearby. It has to be in proximate. It has to be nearby. Says Rabbi Yehuda, in this case, where we're talking about the extra amount, you're taking off the extra amount and you're doing it again. So you took off the initial amount for a different pile of grain. Okay? At that point, that grain was supposed to be minimum, it was supposed to be nearby. But now, if let's say it comes out, that grain was taken away, but now you got to make up the rest. Yehuda says you can make up the rest even if that grain is not nearby. So Yehuda adds to what the first Tana of the Mishnah said, that when you deal with the extra amount, you can measure it, which you typically can't do by truma. Yehuda adds, doesn't even have to be in proximity. Meaning the truma that you're separating for, the extra amount that you're doing for that grain doesn't have to be nearby. That's what Yehuda holds, but that's not the halacha. That according to, we follow the Tanakama, that although they did allow the measuring for the extra amount, they did not allow to do it for a grain that's not nearby. Okay. Sefer HaMitzvot. Mitzvahs laisase shalavay al imay. Prohibition against being intimate with one's mother. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, which means to not be intimate with your mother. Even if she's not the wife of your father, it's your mother who gave birth to you from a relationship out of wedlock. Nonetheless, it's your mother, so she's prohibited. Doesn't make a difference whether this sin was committed while the father was still alive after his death. Or to be witnesses and warning, they both be liable to the punishment of stoning. And if it's talking about without witnesses, if it was done intentionally, kares, they're liable to the punishment of kares, which means divine severance of existence. If it was done unintentionally, situation where a person doesn't even know it's wrong to do, chatas, sin offering. Now, v'meishas aviv. Now, if let's say besides being your mother, your biological mother, it's your father's wife, then you'd be liable for two sins. The fact that it's his mother and his father's wife. The sages instituted that there would be other relatives. The Torah mentions the relatives that are forbidden to marry, and the sages added more, and they're called shniyos derabanan. They're called the secondary ones, the secondary arais, the secondary relatives that are forbidden to have to be intimate with. Aser gam. So from their addition to this, to what the Torah forbade a person from his mother, the sages added the following. Okay. Now you got to keep calculation here, right? We have a man. His name is Reuven. Reuven has a mother, his mother, and a father. his mother had parents, and his father had parents. So here we go. Midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, asr gam be'em imai. He is forbidden not only to his mother, but to his mother's mother. And it keeps going. His mother's mother, her mother, her mother, her mother. Can't marry any of them. Can't be intimate with any of them. The aim im avi imai bovad. Now, from his mother's father's side, they only forbade her. They only forbade, right? They only forbade your mother's father's mother. Okay? Only your mother's father's mother. That's all the sages forbade on that side. Okay, the aim of it, now going to the mother of his father, right? Okay, the mother of his father, not his mother, his father's mother. Okay, she is forbidden according to rabbinic law. And all the mothers going up, her mother, her mother, her mother. Okay, so basically, your father's mother and all the mothers going up from there. The line of mothers. Now, the aim avi other bilvad. Okay, and this last one is the mother of his father's father. Right, the mother. Right, you have Ruvain. He's got a father. Okay, and the mother of his father's father. Okay, again, right? Reuven has a father, right? That father had a mother and a father. Okay, so the father, his father's mother, and all the mothers that her grandmother, great grandmother, all of those in that line, and then you have his father's mother. Okay, Reuven's father's mother. She alone is forbidden midrabanan. Okay, so these are the additions of the prohibition Torah gave on one's mother. These are the mothers that were added on midrabanan. I hope you're able to keep this calculation. Have a wonderful day.